And John, given the lack of direction at Copenhagen and the marginalization of the EU, what's impact is this all going to have on Ireland? What's the Irish government to do, given in light of all these developments?
Well, I think the Irish contribution to climate change at a global scale is insignificant, is the first point, that anything we do in Ireland won't affect the direction of global climate. We will be prisoners of the direction of global climate. But ethically, that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't do our bit. We're a country which has grown economically substantially in the past decade, so we have quite a sizable industrial emissions sector for greenhouse gases. We're also a country which has a huge agricultural sector, and we have as many methane emissions per capita as almost any other country in the world outside New Zealand, for example. So on a level of, if you like, greenhouse gas emissions per capita, we're up there with the big boys. We're higher than the Germanys, we're higher than the UKs, we're higher than almost any country in the world. So we're up in the top 10. So we have a moral responsibility to do our bit to tackle this problem. If we're going to tackle it on a per capita basis, we should perhaps be doing a lot more than some other countries. And I think the implications for Ireland in terms of policy are going to be laid down by and large by what comes out of Brussels. We are committed to a 20% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. We have also got obligations in terms of renewable energy and energy efficiency arising from EU policy. And they will be very challenging targets for Ireland to meet. We found it very difficult, for example, to meet the Kyoto obligations. We expected this year to be buying several hundred million euros worth of carbon credits. The recession didn't necessitate that in the end. But reaching the EU policy, which will not change, which will remain at 20% for the moment, that will be a challenge for Ireland, and we will have to try and find ways of perhaps adapting our national climate change policy, perhaps thinking about energy efficiency a bit more, going towards renewables a bit more, going towards improved insulation in our houses a bit more, planning our settlements more sensibly and more sustainably. A lot of aspects we will have to do to try and meet those obligations, because certainly if we don't, we can't point the finger at anybody else. But we have a lot of impacts which we will have anyway in Ireland, irrespective of what we do or don't do at a national scale. Those impacts will come from the global changes that are taking place. And in particular, I suppose we can categorise those in a variety of ways, but one important set of impacts for Ireland comes in terms of water resources. We know, for example, that we're going to have wetter winters. We know we're going to have significantly drier summers. So we're going to face problems of water supply for our towns and cities, which are already emerging. We've had an acute crisis of water supply over the past week in the Dublin area from people leaving their taps running during a cold spell, which shows us that our water supply, even with winter, is on a knife edge. So when we get a sequence of dry winters and dry summers, then we could face acute problems. So we have to start planning for infrastructural investment, major infrastructural investment, to find new water sources for our towns and cities. We have to look at flood problems. In terms of winter rainfall increases, then the frequency of flood events is going to become much more severe, much more hard-hitting in Ireland, and we have to start thinking about flood protection measures and where we plan roads, infrastructure and people in terms of settlement. So we have lots of impacts in those areas from water. We will have competition, of course, for water in summer from farmers and from people using water for other purposes other than consumption. So there's going to be a contestation of dwindling resources. Apart from water resources, of course, our farmers will face challenges in terms of what they can grow in their fields and how they can manage their farms. We know that by mid-century we will still be growing many of the crops we can at the moment. The wheat, the barley, the oats, for example, will all do quite nicely. Partly helped, it must be added, by extra CO2 in the atmosphere, which is a fertilizer. But some crops like potatoes will do relatively poorly in dry summer conditions, especially on the east and the southeast coasts of Ireland. So we have to start thinking about what we're going to do, whether we're going to continue to grow those crops or whether we switch to maize and whether we change our farming systems to maximise the opportunities of a new changed climate. And if we can position Ireland properly in the light of those concerns, then we have a chance of being not so much a winner from climate change, but certainly a less of a loser from climate change than perhaps some of the countries with which we compete on the international stage. And in that situation, of course, we can remain competitive and we can retain employment more easily. But all of that requires planning, foresight, and leadership. These are the things that we urgently need if we're to tackle this problem.
And John, just to finish up, one of the frustrations too may be from Copenhagen is that there's a danger that individuals in Ireland as elsewhere would conclude that, well, if our leaders don't believe that climate change is so serious that they must act and act dramatically now, then what are we to do? Why should we do anything? So what would you say to people what they should be doing now, despite what did not happen at Copenhagen?
Well, I think individuals have a responsibility, first and foremost, to those people who are dependent on them today and who may be questioning what they did in the future. And I think we all have to look to our own hearts and say, well, if in 20 years' time my children's children stand up and say, what on earth were you doing in 2010? You saw this problem. Why didn't you do something about it? Why have you bequeathed on me a legacy which has fewer options for living comfortably, for living at an adequate standard of material advancement in this world, when it wouldn't have taken too much for you to have tackled the problem in 2009, 2010. So I think that's the first reaction I would have. The second reaction I would think is that, well, we can't always look to our political leaders to get us out of a hole. We have to start thinking in terms of individual action. And really we have to pressurise people from below. We have to talk to our elected representatives and we have to give them the clear message that if they are thinking of doing nothing or thinking of putting this issue on the back burner, we as the electorate will not tolerate that. We will vote for somebody else. That comes, if you like, from what I think is important for decision makers, and that is pressure from below, from their electorate, and pressure from above, from the supranational regulatory authorities. In the case of European countries like Ireland, for example, policy comes from, first of all, the people wanting it, and the people have been very clear in Ireland in climate change issues. They've voted very strongly with their feet, they've voted very strongly with demonstrations, they write to the papers, there's a lot of activism. But secondly, policy is created from direction from the EU in our case, and what's handed down from Brussels and is forced to be written into our legislation is often the galvanising influence in getting things done. So I think if the pressure from above is in some countries at least lessened as a result of what happened in Copenhagen, then individuals should redouble their pressure from below to make it clear that they won't stand for a cop-out, pardon the pun, on this particular.
John, thank you very much, and those are very encouraging words. And I think it's interesting. There was a report recently that showed that given the advances in health benefits and in medicine, that when we talk about what's going to happen to the people 50 to 100 years from now, those people are now being born. So this is not necessarily future generations. These are people who are now being born now, and they're the ones we need to protect. And John, we thank you very much, and we're going to look for you to continue to give us guidance on these issues.